Now, joining us on Skype is former Conservative Member of Parliament, Derek Conway. Thank you very much for joining us on this bulletin, Derek. The issue of extremism is still very prevalent. So do you think the new measures proposed will be effective in tackling the issue?
I think it's probably going the way of those who want to increase the controls. And it would only take one or two more events, particularly in London, before those who argue the human rights case for less government monitoring of its civilian population would just be lost. At the moment, it's hanging by a thread. And part of the visit of Mr. Cameron to the White House wasn't just to boost Mr. Cameron's personal standing in the election campaign that's coming in Britain in May, which is obviously very useful to him. But more importantly, it's because the security intelligence services of the United States and in Great Britain work very, very closely together. CIA operatives are embedded, and it's known to be, there's no great secret, are embedded with the security intelligence service in London and the other way around. So there's a tremendous amount of close work between the Americans and British intelligence services, more so than in any other country. And part of the purpose of Cameron and Obama's get-together was to continue to shore that up. And that's why President Obama was doing his best to promote Mr. Cameron as the man he would like to see still leading Britain after May's general election.
Now, a major part of Britain's appeal to the US is that special relationship that you've mentioned, Derek. I mean, they have economically and diplomatic good relations between each other. Now, regarding the US's relationship with the EU, I mean, should Cameron win the elections and deliver an in-out referendum on Europe, how much would that affect their relationship between each other?
Well, I think Britain is still America's biggest trading partner, and so that the economic relationship is very important. But people forget, you know, in Britain we import more goods from the European Union than we export. So if Britain were to vote to leave the European Union, and personally I don't believe that would happen, but if it were to vote to leave the European Union, there would still be trade agreements because the Germans would make sure there are still trade agreements. And so it's not as if Britain votes for isolation and therefore it's walled up and sails off into the mid-Atlantic. That's not the case. So I think the Americans, I know they're sort of robust and they can get on everybody's nerves, but they're pretty cynical businessmen. Americans are good businessmen. They know what the deals are about. And so they're not going to be led astray by politicians or media rhetoric. They're going to know where the buck stops in British business, and they know that there's still business to be made. So I don't think there's a great deal about that. I think more interesting, one of the discussions which has had less publicity between Mr. Obama and Mr. Cameron is the question of multiculturalism and integration, because in America, where a far fewer percentage of the Muslim population has been attracted to extreme Islamism than has happened here in Britain or in Europe, and people ask why. But of course, in America, for example, there are many members of the US forces who are Muslim. Their minorities in America aren't pushed to the outside the way that has happened, certainly in Britain, but to a much greater extent in France with the banning of the burqa and everything else that they've done over there to try and push young Muslims to believe there is nothing for us in this society. And that creates such a danger for them. America has many lessons to learn, to teach us here in Britain and in France.
Now, Obama, Derek, has said he'll veto a bill calling on further sanctions on Iran, and both of them have publicly rejected calls for further sanctions. Now, does this suggest positive talks in the future?
I think so. Certainly in Britain, the relationship with Iran has become much warmer, and in America, clearly President Obama wants it to be. I think his problem is that the House of Representatives and now the Senate, which has a majority Republican as well. So Congress is against it. And whereas in Britain, the Prime Minister doesn't need parliamentary approval for any of this, in America, President Obama needs Congress approval. And that's where the trouble will lie. But you have to say, you know, if you're drawing a comparison between how Iran behaves and how, for example, Saudi Arabia behaves, what is the difference? Well, many people would say, you know, extreme executions and flogging of human bodies in Iran is unacceptable. And also, it happens in Saudi Arabia. The difference, of course, is Saudi Arabia buys a lot of weapons from America and from Britain, and still their oil production is very important to us. So I'm not sure in foreign policy any of this moral high ground stuff stands any scrutiny whatsoever. It's really a question of what are your interests and what are my interests. And at the moment, America and Britain's interests are merging closer and closer with Iran's. clearly Israel is desperately unhappy about all this.
Yes.
But I think in 5 years' time, Iran will not be seen as the great pariah it has been for the last 25 years.
Now, on the other hand, more controversially, actually, Russia would probably be handed further sanctions on their part in the Ukrainian issue. How does that affect the situation in Ukraine?
Well, interestingly, the Germans were very reluctant to go down this route originally, but they've become much more enthusiastic about it all. And so Angela Merkel and David Cameron had talks at the weekend on Sunday when they were in Paris about this. And Germany is about to assume the presidency of the Council of Ministers. And so Britain is supporting Germany on that, and so far is supporting all that Angela Merkel now wants to do with sanctions to the Russians. But again, the Russians have got immense problems economically because their economic success, limited though it was built entirely on the value of oil and gas. And of course, because that market is now falling, that puts them in an extremely exposed position. Many people in Britain feel it's not in anyone's interest to see Russia pushed back to the extremes. And particularly the business community is very unhappy about this. But likewise, what's going on in the Ukraine is unacceptable. And President Putin is a bully, as many leaders of nations tend to become bullies. And the only way to answer a bully effectively at the end is to stand up to them. And I think that's ultimately what Europe will do to Russia. And the Russian people will decide they got so near to having a decent democracy. They've nearly thrown it all away with President Putin. They have very little time left to try and grab it back. I suspect they will.
Right. Derek, we're just going to have to leave it there. Former Conservative Member of Parliament, Derek Conway, thank you very much for your time.